We are not all born equal when it comes to building muscles. While this shouldn't serve as an excuse to skip the gym, some men seem to have an easier time getting jacked. What you accomplish in 10 years, they achieve in 1. These genetic elites can be found in every country, but there is one continent in particular that seems to imbue its sons with an unprecedented vigor, making them particularly gifted in the athletics department. This continent, of course, is Africa, its sub-Saharan regions being famous for producing physical specimens whose strength and explosiveness have them dominate sprinting competitions worldwide. Along with that dominion also comes a certain affinity towards hypertrophy, to the point that the idea of black men having a muscle building advantage is now widely accepted. This is the BBC genetics meme, which, like all memes, verses into gross generalization. You can find plenty of skinny, fat, or otherwise unathletic black men, just like you can find many sports where the genetic traits that make them so dominant in a race turn into a blatant disadvantage, swimming being a great example. And while it remains entirely possible that men with sub-Saharan DNA could have an easier time building muscle on average, it's not enough to explain the aesthetic physiques of African miners, whose sole workouts consist in their daily hard labor, but who somehow end up with bodies that rival even those of bodybuilders. Their level of fitness is way beyond that of other Afro workers, and is only found in their trade. So, what exactly causes that? Why do African laborers look so jacked? Let's get the genetic consideration out of the way first, since it's both the least interesting and most overanalyzed facet of this whole conversation. When it comes to pinpointing the factors that give black men a muscle building edge, there exists a few hypotheses, the most common one being their advantageous hormonal distribution. Some studies have shown that African men have higher testosterone and growth hormone production on average. They also seem to be fast twitch dominant, the fiber type that bodybuilders target in priority when lifting weights, as these are mostly responsible for visual gains in muscle mass. A quick comparison between sprinters and marathon runners illustrates that nicely. The formers tend to showcase more formidable physiques, while the latter favor a slimmer and more endurant build. Athletes naturally adapt to the demands of their sports, and the body is often the reflection of its environment. This demonstrates a very important nuance in this discussion. There is no such thing as a singular profile of African males. The sub-Saharan continent is first and foremost a land of tribes, which also implies that extreme discrepancies between its inhabitants are to be expected, a reality that our modern understanding of nations as civic entities can blur, but never erase. A single glance at the differences between Hutu and Tutsi is enough to realize that, while these both count as African, the difference in physical attributes points to an evolutionary fork in the genealogy of their people. The idea that every single black male is genetically gifted for muscle building is therefore false. While countries like Cameroon, Nigeria, or Senegal tend to produce more genetic freaks, men who can look jacked without any training are always outliers within otherwise unremarkable groups. They end up catching our attention because they stand out. But to be able to understand why certain groups of African laborers seem to be composed entirely of muscular men, we must look beyond genetics and focus on the common denominator: their profession. To me, there is only one answer that explains these jacked physiques: adaptation. Simply observing the hormonal or structural advantage of black men doesn't teach us much until we understand why only some of them seem to get results. Since we've seen that there exists members of that group who fail to display these anabolic traits, it is therefore very likely that a specific environment was needed to create the conditions suited to the development of more muscular specimens. This points us directly to African laborers, whose daily work conditions force them to put their bodies through repeated stress. But even then, the evidence is not conclusive. It is very easy to find videos of African miners lifting heavy loads who are far from displaying jacked physiques. Actually, quite the opposite is true. The majority have low BMIs and are built for endurance rather than aesthetics and power, which corroborates the idea that not every single male of sub-Saharan descent is destined to turn into a miniature Ronnie Coleman. This also aligns with what we know about European or Asian laborers. While working blue-collar jobs is very likely to develop your strength and resilience, construction workers aren't particularly known for looking like bodybuilders. If anything, most of them are strong fat, meaning they rock a dad bod year-round but are still extremely functional for their daily occupation. The same can be said for these African workers. It might very well be that these bodies are best suited for their profession, and that the lack of calories plus extreme daily expenditure caused by their daily activity prevents them from putting on muscles. In this case, what about Cameroonian miners? At first glance, the physical requirements needed to collect sand from waterways are extremely similar to that of salt mining, and yet they look infinitely more buff than their counterparts. Could it then be that these men are simply from a tribe whose genetic lineage is more conducive to muscle building? It's possible, but doesn't constitute a satisfactory answer, because it fails to take into account the specificity of their trade. It is deep in the waters of the Wouri River that the answer to their jacked physiques hides. Astonishingly, these men dive 20 feet deep to collect sand without the help of any machines. Their job doesn't simply consist of reaching the bottom. They also have to emerge back up while carrying their prize. A task impossible enough until you realize that most of them can't even swim. In most cases, they simply let the weight of the buckets sink them, then collect the sand and exit the water by taking strides on the riverbed. This is essentially the equivalent of doing a farmer's carry underwater, an action they repeat hundreds of times a day. Add to that the constant lifting of heavy sand buckets, plus the never-ending fight to maintain the boats afloat, and you come to understand why they look like perfectly sculpted statues. They are doing gravity-enhanced resistance training on a daily basis, and the more productive they are, the more money they make. This corresponds to our modern understanding of progressive overload, with a twist. While it cannot be denied that African miners got their physiques by lifting and moving heavy loads, the pace at which these loads increased and the methods used to accumulate volume widely differ from the average gym bro training program. First off, these men never go to failure, because doing so would spell death. Instead, their training resembles a form of nucleus overload, where the lifter accumulates large amounts of volume on a frequent basis, and with minimal jumps in weight. Accordingly, the work they do is never truly intense, at least not in the sense that we understand. Diving to collect sand isn't equivalent to doing 3 reps of squats to failure on the nervous system. However, repeating this action hundreds of times a day for years on end will still greatly develop the muscles, because fatigue adds up. Each bucket weighs 18 kilos once filled, or around 40 pounds, that these men not only have to bring to the surface, but also lift overhead and dump into the boat. This is a total body workout for the arms, shoulders, upper back and chest, as they also have to scoop water out of the boats, and are responsible for pushing them to shore once they are full with sand. The tides of the Uri River are extremely strong, requiring sturdy legs and powerful cores to not get swept up by the currents. Between the exhausting work and these dangerous conditions, many drown attempting to come up to the surface for air. Another instance of labor leading to hypertrophy is the case of Cameroon's gold miners, who spend sometimes 12 hours a day swinging their pickaxes and carrying heavy bundles of rock up and down the slopes of the exploitation. Their work conditions are also notoriously grim, and men often get buried under rock slides or die of overwork. This is where the famous UFC fighter Francis Ngannou got his first taste of physical labor, something that partly explains his fantastical frame, as well as answering our question. African laborers look so jacked because they work in a field that leaves no room for weakness. As such, a natural selection bias is established. Those that can't hack it quit, and the ones that survive the ordeal come out to the other side with muscular bodies. As for why few European workers boast similar results, the answer is simple. Developed nations delegate most of the heavy lifting to machines, eliminating the need for fitness. If you suddenly decided to spend the next 10 years of your life picking up buckets of sand hundreds of times a day, chances are that you would end up with a muscular physique as well. Then there is also the difference in resolve. For an African man, losing his job can be synonymous with starvation. Imagine if you didn't just get to go to the gym, you had to. Otherwise, you and your family died. This would likely lead to a massive improvement in your physique. But beyond the environmental element that heavy labor represents, there is another factor to keep in mind: nutrition. If African miners look so big, it's also because they're shredded year-round, which is another side effect of their environment. While they get enough food to survive, they never reach a level of wealth that would allow them to enter a significant caloric surplus. And since an aesthetic physique is first and foremost the result of a body lean enough to reveal the muscles, a population whose access to food is scarce, or reduced to a majority of low-calories whole foods, is much more likely to display individuals whose body fat percentage is consistently in the low ranges. The same can also be said for tribesmen, whose daily hunts keep them fit while never getting to the type of physiques that a regular resistance training regimen can create. But when the conditions are met, and the daily expenditure and caloric intake are balanced, it results in the type of physiques showcased by African miners, both muscular and efficient, without being comically big. This then begs the question: what if we took that genetic material, along with this rough and unforgiving environment, and put it in the context of a gym? Would an African lifter following a proper bodybuilding routine manage to outgrow his blue-collar counterpart and develop an even more aesthetic body? The answer is yes. We have plenty of examples of African men training with minimal equipment and with what some could consider subpar nutrition, who still manage to achieve physiques that most would deem unreachable without steroids. Now, is it maybe possible for these men to be on the sauce? Possibly, but when you look at how aesthetic your average miner can get, I have a hard time believing that any of them could be on anything besides jollof rice and a healthy dose of resourcefulness. Compared to a modern gym environment, their equipment is ancient at best. They lift using cement plates, rusty metal bars taken straight from the scrapyard, and oftentimes have to craft the very implements they are using to build muscles themselves. According to the gurus of optimization, these subpar conditions should translate into poorer results. And yet, the amount of work they put in and the passion with which they attack the weights far outranks the attitude of your average commercial gym goer. It makes sense. Regardless of the gadgets available, what matters most is your mindset when it comes to training. Most African gyms are community owned, meaning that every man there is deeply invested in bodybuilding, to the point that they are willing to put in time and resources to build and maintain a place for them to lift. This would be impressive enough in a Western country, but in Africa, it borders on reckless. But it doesn't stop African bros from getting it done, without modern comfort like AC. This is why I'm personally reluctant to pin the entirety of their success on genetics, as this reasoning sounds like a cop-out and doesn't take into account the two aspects that I find are the most determinant in deciding an individual's success, namely mindset and environment. If you were to take any of the men in this video and plug them in a comfortable Western nation, it is doubtful that any of them would ever be considered genetically gifted, as their physiques would have never materialized, making them only slightly more aesthetic than average. It is their work ethic and drive that have led to these muscular bodies, a statement that applies to every single male in existence. As while we don't get to choose our genetics, the choice to work on ourselves is always available. What these men lack in assets, they make up for in grit. For you sitting at home with all the resources in the world, what is your excuse?